Chapter 2. Ruella was a delightful young lady who had already seen her fair share of harvest festivals. Everyone knew her, and everyone adored her, some perhaps more than their wives would like. She was apple-cheeked and vivacious in the prime of her life. She was healthy, wide-hipped, big-bosomed, unaffected by any skin lesions or malformations, with no obvious diseases, and possessed of all of her teeth. She had lovely dark hair and a rosy smile, which could often be seen curled into a subtle, ironic twist when dealing with fools. Her strong arms and graceful balancing acts could be seen day and night at the Black Pony, where she held the not too terribly enviable position of serving wench. She was a diminutive in stature, but intoxicating nevertheless, due to a pleasant disposition and an exceptional but understated beauty. She had been born to a pair of well-mannered, though extremely bitter and unpleasant local farmers, who spoke little to each other or to their daughter. Sisyphus and Lorame were their names, and they had sent her to school, not for the betterment of her mind, but simply to be rid of the chattering creature who had, without permission, taken over their lives. They maintained an unusual relationship with Ruella during her formative years, treating her far more like a tenant than a child, which gave her both great freedom and great responsibility. She was rarely, if ever, punished beyond a sharp word, and was equally rarely given any reward for excelling at a particular task. However, Ruella learned as soon as she had control of her motor skills and command of language to make simple stew and bread, then more creative foods through the simple experimentations of a child. How does that taste? What about if I do this? She managed to poison herself once or twice, but neither time was fatal, and on both occasions her parents had sighed, rolled their eyes, and called the physician, who administered a vile concoction that made her expel any toxin that might linger in her small body. This same principle of experimentation extended to Ruella's entire landscape of knowledge, wisdom through experimentations, observation, and failure. By puberty, Ruella was both well educated and extremely capable. Though she had eventually ejected from school on the basis of her gender, she had continued to read anything she discovered. This is not to say that the technique her parents employed was particularly praiseworthy, but simply that Ruella herself was an extraordinary person. She had realized quickly that she had no desire to stay with her parents. Though she had no basis for comparison, she was certain that anywhere would be nicer to live than the cold, unwelcoming, decaying walls of the farmhouse and the equally cold, unwelcoming, and decaying souls who lived behind it. Though they had created her physically, Sisyphus and Lorame had no effect on Ruella, beyond demonstrating how to be miserable. This year, Ruella had the unlucky task of working every night of the festival, which, though providing her with much-needed funds, left her with no time to enjoy the reveries herself. She watched, however, as vibrantly distinctive and diverse characters from every corner of her known world came through the dark, heavy wooden doors of the pony. They paraded grandly with elaborate costumes and travel-weary faces of every variety. She saw some heavy-browed and hairy brutes, some fey and unearthly elven folk who were clearly worth their weight in gold. There were shifty and small trolls, some handsome folk emanating charisma and charm, and some who were beyond description. She was asked by almost every one of them for lodging that she could not possibly be provided, for the pony, like every other inn in Jonagand, had been booked for weeks, if not months, ahead of time. The owner of the Black Pony, a small, rotund, relatively benign, rodent-like man named Thalius, who hailed from the mountains far to the north, did his utmost to maximize available space at the inn, and was always ready to accept exorbitant bribes to sleep in the cellar, the stables, or the closets during the festival. That year, Thalius had gone so far as to rent one of the rooms that he and his equally buoyant wife occupied on the second floor. This was an arrangement about which she was far from happy, an opinion she made eminently clear through the constant stomping, shouting, and limb-waving that Lilias was prone to when displeased with her husband. Lilias and Thalius had been married for long before they had ever arrived and purchased the Black Pony, and they had been arguing ever since they had come to town with their wagon. They only stopped fighting to eat, sleep, presumably fornicate, and argue with others. Her most current complaint was with Thalius's choice of tenant. Ruella listened intently to the disagreement as she sleepwalked her way through the duties of serving and clearing tables. She always listened to the arguments, since they rarely stopped to speak with others. The only way one was likely to catch up with them was by eavesdropping. Lilias maintained loudly and forcefully that there was something unsettling about the man staying in that room, and she was so absolutely certain that no good would come of his presence. Besides that, Lilias had lost the use of a private bath, and she would be obliged to share the same room with her husband and their children for the next few days, which destroyed what little privacy they had previously known. She understood full well the extra profit to be had from the desperate lodgers. However, neither she nor Thalius would be able to enjoy the extra money if in the early graves they would certainly wind up in from the stress. Thalius retorted that the man was staying right where he was, that the handsome sum of money he had been paid to make up for any discomfort that Lilias might feel, and in any case the renter was clean and quiet, and Thalius gave not a turnip's worth of concern how Lilias felt about the situation. If she preferred, she could sleep in the stables with the syphilitic sailors and ragamuffins. Lilias had quite a lot to say about that, and retaliated with a threat to withhold physical love from Thalius, at which point Thalius made a comment about preferring the company of sheep anyway, which caused Ruella to nearly drop her tray, because her laughter could no longer be contained. Both Thalius and Lilias suddenly realized that the substance of their argument was audible to everyone in the dining room, and in a rare show of personal dignity they lowered their voices and went into the kitchen to continue their disagreement. It was indeed unusual that Thalius had agreed to rent that room, since he never had done so before. However, Ruella thought as she dodged lecherous hands and disdainfully refused poorly counterfeited coins during the festival, everything was a bit unusual. That evening, she had the opportunity to speak with Lilias about the renter. It was, in fact, Lilias who approached Ruella, in an unprecedented show of anything but irritation, put her filthy, stubby hands to Ruella's young cheeks. "Love," she said kindly, and far more quietly than Ruella was accustomed to, "I want you to stay away from that man, and my idiot husband saw fit to rent one of our rooms too. He's no good, and if I was you, I wouldn't even let him inside to see my face except to serve him his food and wine." Lilia spat disdainfully on the stone floor. Ruella was deeply touched. She knew that she was a valuable employee, since she was one of a select few who did not steal shamelessly, but it was unusual for Lilias to go out of her way for anybody. She said to Lilias haltingly, for she was not certain that she had ever said much more to her than "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am." Thank you, ma'am. You know that I think you are very wise indeed, but I don't understand your concern. All men can be vile, and are capable of iniquity and wickedness. What makes you so sure that there's something amiss with this gentleman? Lilias turned her gaze up to the second-floor balcony, which had a lovely hand-carved balustrade, and her eyes roved about until she was certain that the door next to her own was indeed shut. I can't say. You'd think I was a madwoman, and that I may be. But if you care for your well-being, you'll do as I say. He's a fine-looking man, but there's something unsettling about him I don't care for. I want you to do your best and steer clear of him. There was the sound of a small combustion and shrieking laughter. Lilias whipped around angrily. Now look, the men at the table by the fireplace have managed to set their sleeping friend alight. Oi there, stupid brutes, you'll burn down my bloody inn. She went off towards the troublemakers, waving a wooden spoon menacingly. Her cheeks were cycling through progressively brighter shades of red as her agitation increased. The ruffians who had set their unconscious table-mate on fire seemed highly amused by the whole situation, and were unable to understand the annoyance that such a disruption would cause, though Lilia screamed and berated and chastised. Eventually the dispute was settled with a large tip, threats of violence, and a vacant table. After that, Ruella heard nothing else from Lilias regarding the sinister tenant, though by this point her curiosity was on high alert. That evening, after an exhausting first day of celebration, Ruella decided to take a stroll through the streets of her hometown in the capacity of spectator only. She could not allow herself to succumb to the desire of drinking mead until she lost consciousness, as her day would begin bright and early the next morning. Sadly, being hungover impaired her ability to be of use to anybody. She had no spectacular costume to don, but chose instead a simple ivy-green smock of linen, clasped below her bosom with a large, though fake, yellow gemstone, set into a silver buckle. She wore smart, flat shoes, with moss-green stockings, and tied her hair into a loose bun, held with ivory sticks she had acquired from a hasty and slightly embarrassed departure of a well-to-do woman at last year's festival. Ruella left the black pony and walked slowly. She took in the smells, the raucous laughter, and the tinkling music of fairy bells. She stopped to observe their tumbling acrobatics outside a wagon that the fairies had arrived in. It was decorated with ethereal floating lights and colorful, gently floating ribbons. The fairy performers themselves were terribly diminutive, perhaps 4 feet at the very tallest, and they all had unearthly sharp faces and moonlight-colored eyes that darted quickly about, as though they were hyper-aware of their surroundings. This was probably the case, since full-blooded fairies were a valuable commodity, and often kidnapped and sold as pets, though that custom was virtually unknown during festival time. The fairies, in their strange and filmy gauze-like clothing, tumbled and pranced and performed astonishing acrobatic routines that would be virtually impossible for humans. A particularly nimble young dancer spun ribbons on sticks while it flounced about on the shoulders and backs of the other performers. Ruella was not entirely certain of their genders. This was difficult to divine, since their childlike bodies maintained a nearly sexless appearance throughout their lives, but Ruella had the impression that the star was female. The dance was clearly interpretive, and like all fairy stuffs, it was impossible to determine if there was any sort of meaning hidden in the performance, though to Ruella it seemed outwardly gay, yet unspeakably melancholy at its core. So she moved on. She came to the trinket carts and began to disinterestedly rummage through the merchandise of a pestilent, sickly-looking troll who wheezed and snorted phlegm unapologetically at potential customers. She picked up a wooden box and turned it around in her hands while looking wistfully at a group of acquaintances who were so inebriated they would not likely have recognized her. They were staggering through the street, singing a merry tune, the one on the end holding a half-full flagon of red wine. She sighed and turned back to the troll, who raised one eyebrow and said, enticingly, "Why, that's a genuine article you have there. That comes straight from the ancient gardens of Cortithia. They say it holds magical seeds that grow into beautiful women, in one season only. But then, you don't need that. Or do you? Perhaps you would like that very much indeed." The creature rubbed his warty hands together greedily, and would have said more, but was interrupted by a bout of mucus which had somehow escaped his lungs and was headed determinedly towards his nose and mouth. After a moment, he blinked his watery eyes and looked up at her vaguely disgusted face. "What do you stare at? I've got allergies. Can't you see anything? There's enough man-dander here to fell a whole horde of proud warrior trolls. You stink of human. If you won't buy my wares, then make room for paying customers. Shoo!" he exclaimed, and made a brisk sweeping gesture with his wrist. "Be off!" Ruella turned to leave, but at the last moment decided to take pity on the wretched thing, and bought a piece of amber that encased a flower. The troll became excited when she held out her money. He began to expound on the glories of the object. "Oh, that's a fine purchase, that is. Extinct and rare flora is my specialty, as I'm sure you can tell. There's a Golden Empress, and it has, very specific and remarkable properties. I can sell you a book about them for only 50 additional copper coins. What a deal! You would indeed be a fool to pass it up. Incautious use of the Golden Empress can lead to unforeseen consequences. Wait! Where are you going, you wretched girl? Don't be daft. Only 30 copper coins. 30! How can you deny?" His voice trailed off, as Ruella, exhausted by his insistent proffering, after already paying him so well for the trifle, wandered off into the evening. She sat on a bench for a spell, watching the night wind down, mainly due to the inability of the attendees to buy, eat, or drink any more. She made her way slowly back to the inn, where she had a small room on the third, topmost floor. There were a couple of stragglers who had not been fortunate enough to gain access to a room, and who had lost consciousness in the main hall. They were now being mercilessly harassed by Lilias, who had traded the wooden spoon in favor of a broom, and who was swatting the bedraggled pair and shooing them towards the door. Ruella went back towards her room, but as she passed the second floor on the quiet stairwell, she paused to look curiously, yet cautiously, at the door of the man she had so unusually cautioned against. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and all was quiet. Her curiosity overwhelmed her good sense, and she crept to the door after removing her shoes as silently as possible. Pressing her ear to the door, she heard low voices, of which there was clearly more than one. The first seemed to be the voice of someone rather elderly, and the other was a somewhat low, musical tenor belonging to an adult male. There was a sudden pause, a shuffle, muffled whispers, and the sound of fabric, like sheets being spread onto a mattress. Footsteps approached the door, and fast as she possibly could, Ruella made for the stairs, as there was no nook or cranny in the hallway to duck into. She had just set her feet on the steps when there was a loud creak and a distinct cough. She cringed at her own fatuousness and composed herself quickly before she turned around. The man before her was probably human, though there was a sudden and overpowering emanation of the supernatural from him. It was there and gone, like a wave, but it made her whole frame shudder briefly and fiercely. He seemed not to notice, and simply smiled up at Ruella, who had already advanced a step or two up the staircase. "May I be of assistance, miss?" asked the tall, lean man. Ruella examined his face and found a slight trace of amused irritation, but whatever had made her so suddenly uncomfortable was almost instantly gone, and she smiled meekly back. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm the serving girl, and I heard voices." Her excuse sounded lame, even to her own ears, and she trailed off. "Yes, I often speak to myself. It helps me focus," he replied, and though she knew perfectly well he was dissembling, she decided it was far beyond her business to inquire further, and made as if to curtsy a good evening. "Wait, miss. Please gift me with your name, so that I may address you as something other than serving girl." His dashing, somewhat plump lips were curved into a crooked smile, which was quite entrancing. Wickedly innocent blue eyes were placed on a somewhat oval face, an agreeable, though marginally aquiline nose, and a head topped with dark blonde curls cropped short. He had a very old scar, perhaps from childhood, which ran down the far side of his face, from eyebrow to cheekbone. It contributed to a distinctly irregular balance that gave his face such character that Ruella found herself almost powerless against his charisma. He wore practical traveling garb, but carried himself with a great deal of dignity, as a noble might. The young man was lean and not overly muscular, but seemed to Ruella to have a perfect construction. "Ruella Havenham," she stuttered out, her face growing a florid shade of red, out of embarrassment that she had thought to impede on the privacy of such a well-meaning gentleman. "Well, Ruella Havenham, I am Galen Ferdano, and should you find you do need something, you clearly know where my door is, and you are most welcome to enlist me in your employment at any time. I am indeed here to provide a wealth of mystical services, as well as being a passable marksman." He paused briefly, and walked up to the lobster-red Ruella. He took her hand from its sad position of dangling limply at her side, and held it up in his own. "Oh, indeed. Why, Miss Ruella, you are most decidedly in the wrong line of work, as I initially suspected. I see from your aura that you have also made a mystical purchase tonight. A Golden Empress? Oh, those Strolls and their salesmanship." He chuckled and released her hand. "I hope he didn't convince you it had great magical power." "Oh, no," she exclaimed. "I simply bought it to look at. It's quite lovely." She pulled it from her satchel and held it up in the light. The amber caught the firelight from the main hall, where even Lilias could still be heard cursing. The flower inside the stone was immaculately preserved, which until this point Ruella had been virtually unaware of. Its petals looked as though they would be fresh and fragrant, were the amber to vanish. They both studied it for a moment in silence. Galen spoke slowly and carefully. He reached his hand out hesitantly and touched it briefly, studying its construction. "Yes, it is indeed a most beautiful trinket, though sadly not good for anything but a paperweight. Happily, though, you are clearly a wise young lady, and have made this prediction yourself. Well, I have much studying to attend to. You will, I hope, have a wonderful evening. Good night, Miss Ruella." Galen turned around and strode back into his room. He shut the door without turning round, and after a moment of dumb immobility, Ruella crawled up the stairs and into her own dear bed, where she fell asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow. That night her dreams were troubled and fearful, scenes of being observed from a far-off threat, and trying to hide, but not succeeding.